Enjoy your meeting. Just a reminder, today's meeting is being recorded.
All right, we're good to go. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so to talk real quickly on the compliance side of things and some of the assessment services. So the organization as a whole completed over 200 plus assessments last year. We really break those down. When you look at it, we have quite a broad offering as far as assessments and what we focus in. On the payment card industry side of things, we look at everything from general PCI certifications. So that's basically merchants or service providers on the back end. We do payment application certifications, and we even do the point-to-point encryption certs as well. So we see a lot of different organizations in that space. We also focus on healthcare, meaningful use, risk assessments, just general pieces. So basically the covered entities, basically hospitals or back-end business associates, we also certify. We also help do a lot of preparatory work in the SOC space. And then just general pieces, those certifications also deal with FISMA, so that's some of your federal standards that we deal with. MARS-E is a standard basically that we do for some of these healthcare exchanges that are connecting into the federal system, and obviously we touch on a lot of different just general risk assessments. So really what we're drawing from is a sampling of what we see with this. So you've got multiple industries, multiple different types of companies. So we see a lot out there. We see a lot of the right things to do. We also see some of the wrong things to do, and that's really what we're going to be drawing from today as we cover some of these topics. So next slide, Gates. Okay, so to cover some of the trends that we're seeing from an industry perspective, one of the big ones that we've seen in the payment card industry over the last 12 months is really the adoption of EMV technology, or at least the planned adoption of it, albeit some places are further behind than others. And this is really an important point from a technology perspective as well as from a breach standpoint, with the idea being that EMV as a technology is really there to help reduce some of the risks around processing credit card transactions across the payment channel, ideally reducing the number of breaches that we've seen. I'm sure everybody over the last year has seen all of the credit card breaches that are out there. The problem with this right now is that really when you look at that as a technology, most of the rest of the world has really adopted EMV as a technology. The U.S. is really the only one that's lagging behind that still has magnetic stripe data for processing credit card transactions. And part of the problem with that is if you're an attacker, we're really the low-hanging fruit here in the U.S. So a lot of the breaches and the things that you see, especially with the bigger retailers here in the U.S., you're going to continue to see that because this is the easiest place to capture that data. So certainly the adoption of EMV is a good thing. It has additional security controls built into the system, and ideally once it's finally adopted, will help to protect that payment channel, and hopefully we should see less breaches in that space. Next slide, Gates. So one of the things that we've seen overall, when you talk about all of these industry standards, whether it's PCI or the healthcare space or even SOC, you've kind of seen, say, over the past 15 years, right, there's been a big shift in industries to outsource responsibility for certain business operations. And that's great. There are certainly advantages to that operationally. But some people have seen that as an effort to also outsource the risk or liability from those operations. And what we've seen, say, over the last 2 to 3 years with a lot of the compliance requirements or the federal regulations is really a shift away from that model from a liability perspective. And the point being is that when you look at any of these standards across the board, really what they're basically saying is, look, you guys can outsource daily operations. You can outsource certain security controls, but you can't outsource the risk and the liability. And so they've really tightened that up and really focused on making sure that there are strong vendor management controls in place. And I think that's something for everybody on the call to be aware of, is that, it's great to outsource those things, and there certainly are advantages to it, but realize that from a governance or a compliance standpoint, you guys are still on the hook for demonstrating compliance with your third-party vendors. I think that's a big area that we've seen be tightened up over the last couple of years across the board with all of these standards. Next slide. So to kind of finish this off, and I'll hand this off to Gates Marshall, who will cover some of the cybersecurity pieces. One of the things that we see, and there's actually some recent activity around this, is kind of this idea of compliance versus security. And the real issue here is what happens is many times people think, well, we've demonstrated compliance with PCI. That's all we really need to do. And I think we would all agree on the call, you see the breaches that are out there. A lot of times these companies are, in fact, certified according to PCI. That's really just the minimum bar from a security perspective. Being compliant does not mean that your organization is secure or has mitigated all of the risks that you should be looking at. So that's something that we like to call out to folks, is just so that they understand that, hey, it's great that you're certified or compliant with PCI or HIPAA or whatever it may be, but realize that that may not be addressing all of the risks that the organization has. Certainly that should basically be looked at. Any compliance effort should be looked at as a baseline for your security program, right? You should build up off of that, not that being the endpoint or goal from a security perspective. That's really minimum bar when you start talking about risk management or security. So with that, I'll hand this over to Gates. I'm going to let him go through some of what they've seen on the cybersecurity side of things.
Thank you very much, Greg. So absolutely, we're going to cover a couple of things, but really the focus here is, to Greg's point, compliance does not equal security. Compliance standards are typically fairly static documents. They update themselves once a year, once every few years. Security, on the other hand, the criminals are out there every day trying to figure out how to defeat our security controls, how to get access to us. And so what I want to take a minute or a few minutes and cover is really talk about who's attacking you, how are they attacking you, what are they after, why is this happening to you now, and then when we go over, and David Greenwell will kind of talk about what are some real-world approaches that we can use to try to mitigate some of the risks that's out there around that. So the first piece is who's attacking us. There's really four distinct groups. So we have hacktivists. They're really not out for financial gain, but they're looking to make a point, whether that be for a social cause or for reputational improvement within their own communities and that sort of thing. Then we've got two different sets of criminals that we'll see. So we have kind of lower level criminals, and I think we think about these lower level criminals and it's like these are not a kid in the basement like hacking into something anymore. This is now going to be a group of people, probably a small group. Their skills may not be really high, and what makes them so dangerous is because the underground ecosystem for these criminals is kind of matured, they don't have to be able to create all of the exploitation tools that they're using. They can just lease them, they can buy them, they can use them as a service, and so you don't necessarily have to have a huge level of skill to be able to perpetrate some of these crimes. When we move up there and we start to talk about advanced persistent threats, organized crime, criminal syndicates, and so at this point, these are what we're seeing a lot of around some of the Cryptolocker or crypto wall problems. So they are now targeting markets. They are typically looking to get in wherever they can, whereas the lower level criminal is just who's the lowest hanging fruit, how can I make the dollar the quickest. The APTs are probably focused a little bit more in certain vertical areas around that. They have a lot more investment in technology as far as creating their own exploitation tools. They're also typically very dispersed geographically, and this is a huge challenge for us because as we look at law enforcement efforts to track down and kind of eliminate these syndicates existing, when they exist in 3, 4, 7 different geographic regions, jurisdictions, there's a lot of formality that has to occur for our law enforcement agencies to be able to get through, and frankly, the criminals are just quicker. The last thing that we see there is nation-state attacks, and so we're not going to talk a lot about nation-state attacks, but just want to realize that these 4 buckets kind of define your general threat agents that are out there.
Yeah, Gates, just to jump in here real quick on the crime syndicates and the organized crime piece of that, that's something that I think is an important item to note for everybody on the call is you really do see these organizations functioning like a multinational corporation, right? They have people working all over the world. They're very patient. They are going to get into an environment. They're going to move around slowly, and they're going to figure out what data is there that can be monetized. And they are functioning just like a business. They are literally going to look at what their return on investment is. They're looking at this as a long-term play, and to me, that's really what's driving a lot of that advanced persistent threat that we see out there. So I just think that's an important item to note that we haven't really seen, say, until the last 5 years or so.
You're absolutely correct about that. And, to the extent that within these larger criminal syndicates and groups, you really have specialization. So people have expertise within a certain area, and you may have to utilize 10 or 12 resources collectively to go from I have an exploitation to I translated that into cash in our pockets. So it's definitely very advanced. It's something that we haven't seen a lot of historically, although we've still had some of these same elements that are at risk. But then the question becomes, why is this happening to us now? What's different now than previously that's causing these uprisings to occur of these groups, and it's kind of what we're seeing in the news? And unfortunately, the answer is here. So if you don't get anything else out of this presentation, please get this. This problem, this breach epidemic that we are dealing with is not going away, and this is why it's not going away. Technology has increased to the extent that now a criminal can make a very successful living buying and selling or reselling stolen information. And what really helps to make that occur is they can do it with anonymity. And so it's a combination of two things realistically. The first is cryptocurrency, and whether we're talking about Bitcoin or some other currency, typically a cryptocurrency is not going to be a regulated form of currency. It offers some level of anonymity within the cryptocurrency exchange happening, so you don't necessarily know who's paying you or who's being paid. There are actually laundering services, just like you would think of money laundering in a traditional sense. There are laundering services with crypto coins to make sure that you really can't tell where the money came from or where it went. And so now we have an ability to pay or to be paid in a way that promotes non-repudiation, combining that with technologies such as Tor and I2P. And so what these are basically abilities to do anonymous routing, or onion routing as it's sometimes called. And so you can't necessarily tell where somebody's coming from or where they're going. And so when you combine these two things together, I have anonymity within my transportation, and I also have anonymity within my transaction. It's very challenging to hunt these folks down, and we're going to continue to see this to propagate because of that, whether it's Tor, I2P, some other cryptocurrency, whether we're using money pack cards or whatever it may be that the criminals are choosing to use, these alternative payment methods that have been created for creating this epidemic for us. So I want to take a moment and talk about what type of data can be monetized. And I think we all think, hey, keep your credit card in your wallet. Whatever you do, don't take your credit card out of your wallet. I can remember being a kid and my mom literally closed-pinning an envelope with like $20 in it or something to my shirt to make sure I didn't take it out. And I think a lot of us still use that same type of mentality that if I keep it in my pocket, it's safe. And what we have to recognize is that this is not just focused on, credit card theft or something like that. Anything that has value to you, chances are can be monetized by someone else. And so what we've done, and you may see some of the images on the screen, this is from an underground forum where stolen information, accounts, that sort of thing are bought and sold. And wanted to put it out there to really have people understand that this isn't like two people meeting behind Walmart exchanging envelopes. I mean, this is just as user-friendly as eBay or something like that. And as a matter of fact, similar to eBay in the sense that if you look at some of the images, for example, the hacked American airline accounts or miles that are available, the vendor has a trust rating. And so this criminal is not going to rip you off because they've been proven to be very effective at what they're doing. At this point, go ahead and take a look, and we can see that based upon the thing that's out there, you might think that your Sky Miles are only valuable to you. Well, in fact, someone will sell 300,000 of your Sky Miles for about $100, so it's valuable to them as well. Not limited to just things like that. So we can see Uber accounts, very similar thing. Maybe somebody wants to get somewhere, doesn't want to pay for the ride. So you can go ahead and purchase an Uber account for $1 or $2 and be able to utilize that. So it's very scary stuff. Same thing, somebody may purchase a PayPal account. They're not so much looking to find a PayPal account that has money in it. They may just want to buy an account to then use as a filter to run additional money through and kind of bounce around. All sorts of stuff can happen there, but really what we want to emphasize here is that this can be anything. This could be your Kohl's cash. This can be any element that has a value to you that can be monetized by a criminal will be. And things that can't be monetized externally, they have another way to elicit money from you there.
Yeah. I think the other thing to call out here that's amazing to me is that this is a mature marketplace, right? You have trust amongst thieves, right? They're so mature that they even have their own rating system to establish who's reliable and who's not.
Agreed. And it's kind of scary that there's almost like this criminal credo out there to say, we will not rip you off. I mean, if you're buying stolen stuff from us, well, you can trust me. And so you're absolutely right. There is a lot of maturity in the sales channel to the extent that they will give you guarantees. And what we see here on the screen, this is from another set of websites. So this website specializes in selling stolen credit card numbers. So if you take a look at the image over on the left-hand side, we can kind of tell that we have various card types and so on and so forth. Typically a stolen credit card will resell for anywhere from $1 to about $20. Depends on what the card brand is. If it's a classic card or if it's a high limit card, then you're going to be able to monetize that for more. What they do in addition, if we look over on the right-hand side, these are where some dumps are out there, and so they group these stolen credit cards together and then sell them in a group, so you can pick from that. And so the top one is called Hockey Teeth, which I believe that's a Canadian hockey star that we see in the picture and looks kind of cool or what have you, but if you'll notice there, the validity rate, if I buy a stolen credit card from them, they estimate to be 94% of these cards are good, which means they're probably fresh, because the quicker it is for the criminal from the time they steal the cards from you to resell it, the higher the likelihood is that that card is going to be valid, and that they're going to be able to collect revenue. But if for whatever reason that card doesn't work, if you notice there, replacement time of 30 minutes. So if I buy a stolen credit card and it doesn't work, they're going to give me another stolen credit card that will work within 30 minutes. That's amazing.
Yeah, we were talking about this internally the other day. I actually had my Amex compromised from some transaction and had to get it replaced, and it took them 7 business days to get me a new card, right? And we were talking about how amazing it is. These guys have better service than the card brands.
They do, and they have phone numbers you can call. There's forums. There's interactive chat. I mean, it's really a very matured sales channel, and we don't anticipate this to change. So I know the stuff that we've talked about so far is really focal around pay, some credit cards, or online type of fraudulent activity. But the reality is that those same criminals can make this real in the real world really quick and pretty cheap as well. So the next time you're thinking about going on that vacation to that deluxe cruise, maybe don't post it on Facebook. So what this is, and we've got a couple more examples that are out there, is we're taking a look at what would it cost to have a physical ID created for someone, anyone for that case. And so first off, if all I have is maybe your name, your phone number, just very little information around you, I can spend about $10 and go through effectively a LexisNexis type service and get all of your other information. I can then take that and spend another, in the picture that we see down on the lower left-hand side where it says fake ID, so that's a Georgia ID, I can go ahead and take that and for $35 or something, have them put a driver's license physically in the mail to me, my picture, your information, or whatever information I'd like to put on there. And when we're talking about these IDs, please recognize that this is not like the old school thing where, I kind of glued my picture on top and I taped it and don't turn it over and I butter knifed it open or whatever it is. These IDs are impressive. So they will pass a flex test. They'll get right through TSA. The barcodes on the back are valid. They have holograms, as you may see in the other beyond fake image that we have there. So it can be really real, and unfortunately, it's really inexpensive. As we can see in the top image above, over on the right-hand side where it's a custom identification service, maybe I need to get a Social Security card made for you. It costs about $5. So we have to recognize that when you post on Facebook, hey, I'm going to go on this cruise for a week, somebody could quickly collect your information, create an ID out of it, and start to open a real-world credit that you're going to receive the bill for at some later point in time. Very scary stuff. And it's collective cost to go from, hey, I have your name, to, hey, I have a fake ID and fake bank forms and things in your name. Yeah, it's under $100. So it doesn't cost like $1 zillion for somebody to steal your identity. So let's take a look at how you're being attacked and how this is occurring. And we're actually seeing a lot of this in the news right now, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in relevance to Cryptolocker and some of these other ransomware threats. But depending on who's attacking you determines how they're going to attack. Because a hacktivist is focused on a particular social or important issue to them, but not necessarily financial gain, they're really targeting whoever it is they want. The lower level criminals, they're just looking for low-hanging fruit. Typically they're going to use malvertising, and so this is going to be where you go to a web page. I know you're already thinking, Gates, I don't go to that sort of web page, right? Definitely, I do not go to that sort of web page. You probably do, because this isn't just in certain web pages. This can occur on very well-known branded sites that we all go to for whatever reason. We have some pictures over where people were kind of posting on Twitter at a point in time around, hey, MSN's got some bad stuff on it. It's going to happen everywhere. And so this is typically how they're going to get in. Organized crime, they're looking a little bit more focal, as Greg was mentioning as well. They are not necessarily in it just for the quick buck. They want the big buck, and they're willing to go longer in order to get that. And so they may be looking at indirect attack methods as well. When we see something like the Ashley Madison hack, where information was exposed, and it's probably information that people don't want to be exposed, they're not necessarily going to take that and directly monetize it, but they may then use that to move into more of a blackmail scenario or something otherwise to be able to get someone to do something that they want. They do, of course, also have various tools and techniques, and so these exploit kits, which organized crime will buy an exploit kit from an exploit kit manufacturer, and then that manufacturer will even supply them custom modules and say no other criminal syndicate will have access to this particular exploit for a certain amount of time or for a certain amount of exploitations, and so really hard to defeat there. And finally, nation states. If a nation state wants into your systems, my systems, anybody's system on this call, they can get in. They have the most persistence, they have the most resources, really can't be stopped, and that's unfortunately a reality that we're dealing with today is you're not going to prevent the breach. So I want to talk a little bit more about how these attackers are doing this, because I think we often think like, hey, there's just this one person and they're breaking into my computer actively and they're doing what they're doing. And that's not necessarily the case. A lot of times you have one criminal that may have control over thousands of computers, and that's really what we see here in some of our images through these exploit kits, and they form botnets, that is, kind of take your computer and make your computer under their control to do whatever they choose. So the first image that we see is where someone is taking control of an Android-based cell phone. Once they have control of that phone, they can do all sorts of stuff to it. That middle image, and this is one that I think is really insightful, this was from a particular botnet that we were able to have some visibility into. And so one person or a small group of people likely run this botnet. As you can see, we've kind of highlighted out, there's 14,000 computers that they have under their control, and that could be one or two people that do that. And I know you're thinking, that won't be me. We don't run Windows XP. We don't run Windows 2000. We run the latest stuff. If you take a look, there's a lot of Windows 7, even Windows 8.1 computers that have been infected, so not just vulnerable to old school stuff. And then the next question is, well, how does one person get information out of 14,000 computers? They use more automation. And so what we see in the image over on the right-hand side is kind of from an exploit kit what the attacker may see, and they can just drill in and say, hey, for this group of 1,000 computers, go ahead and get me all the passwords in their Google Chrome, or go ahead and get me all of their email contacts, and it just kind of sucks it up out of their system and presents it to the attacker so that they can use that to do additional malicious activities. Very scary. And it gets even more scary. So what happens after I've been infected? So I go to this website and there's some malvertising on it, and somehow that downloads this exploit kit into me, whether that be into my phone, into my computer. They can do a whole lot. And so what we see here on the left-hand side is effectively an interface for cell phones. Now, these happen to be Android phones, and For anybody who's on the call, if you happen to have an Android phone in your pocket, you've got a pretty high risk basis, and it really has to do with the fragmentation of the patch cycle between Google and the manufacturers, and won't get into that here, but nonetheless, iPhones are also vulnerable to this type of exploitation. But as we can see, they've picked a particular phone, and they can do all sorts of stuff. They can go to GPS pinpointer and find out where are you in the world. They want to know what you're doing. They'll just turn on remote ears and start listening to your conversation that you're having. They want to know what you're seeing. They'll just turn on your camera and start looking at what you're seeing. Do you remember those text messages you thought you deleted? No, not so much. Those are still in the phone, and they can just go up to SMS Tracker and basically pull all your deleted text messages out, get access to all your contacts, your passwords. There's just a lot of things that can occur there, including manipulation of the device's functionality, and that's really that middle image where at this point they can now turn off your phone, they can turn off SMS, they can remove your ringer, lock your screen, do all sorts of things to you. And then finally, over on the right-hand side, what we're looking at, more of a traditional interface for a computer. So what I really want to emphasize here is that this is not like binary, all ones and zeros in the matrix. These are very efficient, effective interfaces to allow these criminals to conduct whatever malicious activities they are intending to do so in an efficient manner. This is one of the hugest problems of our time, and unfortunately we are just at the beginning wave of this problem, and so everybody at this point is probably seeing something out there around Cryptolocker, CryptoWall, Tesla Crypt, whatever the case may be, and we've thrown a couple of quotes up there, and so unfortunately this isn't just a matter of, well, if I call the right people, they can help me out. As we can see in some instances, the FBI said, hey, if you want your stuff back, you're going to have to pay. So this is a completely different modality for exploitation, and everything that we've seen previously where I'm stealing your credit card number and I'm reselling it or whatever, I have to get into your stuff, get to your cookie jar, get stuff out of your cookie jar, get it out of your environment, and then sell it. This is a completely different modality because all I have to do is get into your house and then lock up all the rooms. And at that point, who wants your stuff more than you? Not many people. So it's very different. There's no exfiltration that needs to occur. And I'll just briefly mention that the city of Detroit at a point in time did have their centralized city database locked up. I think the hackers wanted, maybe it was $500,000. They didn't pay. Well, they didn't get their database back. Something else happened, and in the example for the sheriff's office there, what they did wrong, that being the sheriff's office, is someone in that sheriff's office was on a streaming music site, like a radio station. I know I certainly go to them, and there just happened to be a malicious ad, and that's all it took. So we just want to recognize that this is a real issue. We're going to take a little bit of a deeper look at how that occurs as well. All right, so let's talk about how do you get ransomware infection, and I'll try to keep this somewhat not technical, but just want to understand that this is going to be a very challenging thing to try to mitigate or defend against, and to an extent, there is no effective absolute mitigation to guarantee you security here. So it all starts with a bad ad, or it could be a phishing email, and we know that, certainly we get those emails, but whatever it may be, you go to a website, it has a malicious ad on it, that malicious ad ends up being able to exploit JavaScript or something of that nature, and then it goes out and it downloads the exploit kit and gets the exploit kit running. The exploit kit is then going to download some sort of module. So typically it's a staged piece. The exploit kit downloads a base module or a loader to then load more modules. In this one I'm referencing ransomware, but keep in mind, just because they're locking up all your files and looking for ransom doesn't mean they didn't also grab all your passwords before they did that. So they can download multiple modules. At that point, they go ahead and register your host and they say, hey, I've got this computer infected, I'm locking everything up, want to make sure that you know who they are so you can tell me the link they need to go to pay money. They go ahead and they lock up all the files, and then they remove all your backups so you can't get those files back. Just to talk a little bit, so the C2 server reference there is command and control, so that's going to be the attacker. And then the DEC that we see there is a data encryption key, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And so here's why you're not going to be able to defend against this or to easily track these folks down. In that second step where they're downloading the exploit kit, a lot of times they will utilize a real website out there that they've compromised some sort of content management system, so we're thinking WordPress, things of that nature. A lot of times that's done through the plugins or extensions that are used on those sites. And so when you're looking at your web filtering logs or something like that, this is not going to hackersrs.com. This is going to a site that just last week was a great site. It was a legitimate site, and so they've compromised it. And what they're doing is they're using that site as a proxy to go between you into where they actually are located. And so typically that compromised content management system is going to have a proxy to relay over to what's called a Tor entry guard. And so this entry guard is going to be a computer under the control of the attackers, and it's going to then allow them to pass over that Tor network that we talked about a little bit earlier. And so we can tell where the entry guard is if we were able to get to the compromised DNS, which is somewhat unlikely. But we can't tell between the entry guard and the C2 servers where those are located due to the fact that we have Tor there and it's extracting all that. So just recognize that it's a real challenge, and we have to be innovative around how we're going to be addressing that. Just a couple more just snapshots that we took to kind of show that unfortunately this is one of those things that you may have to pay to get your stuff back. So the reality is, if you have appropriate mitigation, and mitigation in this case is backup, you can recover without paying. But if you don't, in some cases you don't, there's not a whole lot that you can do about it.
Yeah, I think along those lines real quick, I think the theme that you'll see, and Greenwell is going to get into some of this towards the end of the presentation, is, a lot of this stuff, certainly you want controls, preventative controls. You want to try and keep these people from getting in. But I think what organizations really need to shift into is looking at what controls do you have in place that help you identify this type of stuff that's going on in the environment. Whether it's a breach, whether it's Cryptolocker, the quicker you identify it, the smaller the impact is to the organization, right? I think that's a common theme that we see across the board. So, that Greenwell's going to talk more about that, but I think that's something that's important for you guys to be thinking about, is how could you identify this if it were going on inside of your organization today?
100% agree, Greg, because in some cases you can't prevent it, so the best thing you can do is detect it, and the quicker you do that, the better. Before we get to that, though, I just want to cover, because I know some people on the call are probably thinking, Gates, we've put millions of dollars into our various security controls. We've got the best of the best. We should be well protected. And just recognize that there are things that criminals can use, such as cryptors, to specifically evade the antivirus technology that you've implemented. When we talk about these websites, whether that be the website that's serving the exploit kit or whether that be the compromised CMS, it's not so much, like, hey, I've got this great web content filtering thing, WebSense or whatever it may be. And so we see the picture over on the right-hand side. There's a particular URL, and we've grayed that out so we don't expose it. But at the point in time that we took this image, only 2 of 66 web content filtering engines were able to detect that this site was bad. So you hope that you're in the 2 and not in the other 64. Finally, just want to make a point that this stuff is happening so fast. There's nearly 1 million new pieces of malware created every day, and so you've got to have some automation in your defense, just as the attackers have automation in their exploitation. With that in mind, I'm going to pass it over to Dave Greenwell to talk a little bit more around the systematic way that we can try to approach and protect ourselves against these threats.
Thank you, Gates. Good information there, and definitely scary stuff that's going on in the world out there. So what I do is I basically focus in on some of the assessments that our teams do and work with them to help customers remediate and kind of tighten up the security model, per se. One of the things that we typically see in our audits is a lack of internal focus on security. There's no real management or direction or even dedicated resources assigned to look at the security posture of the company. There's no formal processes and procedures in place is a big one, where everybody is just basically flying by the seat of their pants and deploying systems as they need it, and trying to keep up with the demand, things like that. And the big one that we see is, as Gates alluded to, all I have to do is get access one time into an environment, and that's usually done through an employee. So through a phishing attack or whatever, or just web browsing to different areas that shouldn't be web browsed to. So that is a big area that needs to be addressed. The other thing is, obviously what Gates has been talking about here is that malware, drive-by malware, is probably one of the biggest high-risk areas today. and those targeted attacks are increasing. The other area that we see, and Gates can attest to this, is the weak credentials. We'll talk about that and how we can mitigate that. But that's typically, once I get into the network, the attacker basically will do searches and basically log into various devices using default admin accounts and things like that. Go ahead. So what my group does really is we look at what kind of framework we should approach the security model with. And obviously, we talked about PCI and HIPAA and some of those others, but those are specific niche markets or niche compliance programs that look at specific areas that address credit cards or healthcare information, but it really doesn't look at the whole holistic picture of the company's network. So NIST has really been in the forefront in developing this cybersecurity framework. It's still under development, but it's really making some good headway. But the thing that we like about it is that it has 5 domains that really are the key domains of what you need to be focusing in on for a security posture. And that is to identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And if you notice, there's a continuous cycle there. So it's something that doesn't just get put in place one time. It's continually looked at and revised and updated. And then that will basically give you the optimization of your security posture. And the Gates said we all have cookies, that we need to protect, and obviously the whole intent here is to keep the cookie monster out of the cookie jar. So from an identify standpoint, this is pretty much the key focus of what you need starting point. In that if you don't know what you've got on your network, then you don't have any clue as to how you're going to protect it. So you've got to be able to identify and know every device that's plugged in, and especially with the onslaught of Internet of Things. People start plugging different devices into your network. Well, that basically introduces points of compromise. So you got to understand what the impact of that device is and how you maintain and control it. Really, I think what people ought to do is, if you haven't done one, do a security risk assessment. And that will force you to look at an inventory of your systems and look at the data that's on those systems and basically prioritize where are our highest risks and what can we do to mitigate those risks. The policies are an important place to start. So if you don't have any policies in place, I would recommend that you start looking at not only the policy side, but also the procedural side, and we'll get into that a little bit as well. Data discovery is huge, and there have been a number of times we've gone on site and done data discoveries using various tools, and there was one instance where I was at a call center, and the accounting group had a spreadsheet with a bunch of credit cards in it, and they swore up and down, no, it didn't. And I said, well, my tool found that file, and we opened it up, and sure enough, there were no credit cards being displayed, but when you looked at the top of the columns, it was A, D, C, F, G, and once we unhid the columns, there was the credit card information, and that is not a good security model. Obviously, that data is there, you're just not seeing it. Unified Security Management also has some asset discovery tools and vulnerability management things. You've got to understand an environment, and that's some of the key areas there. Next. So
yeah,
once
just to jump in here
go ahead.
real quick, Greenwell, I think as far as the identification piece goes with the threat management, that's an area I think everybody should be looking at. We worked a breach scenario last year of a payment gateway, and the attacker, when all the information came out, had basically been in the environment for 5 to 6 years, okay, and they had never been identified. So I think that, that is one of the key areas that you guys need to look at is what is the normal mode of operation? Do we have the appropriate tools in place to identify outliers, and how do we respond to that?
That's good comment there, Greg. Appreciate that. So from a protection standpoint, really, this is the crux of what you need to be looking at, what you're implementing to protect your environment. And it's not just technology, it's also, again, policies and procedures, but security awareness training for your employees, things like that. But I would say some of the key points in here, I'm not going to go into every one in detail, but compartmentalization or isolation, where you build a segmented network, and if you can, to the nth degree. There's micro-segmentation things that are going on today. But you've got to be able to delineate different systems into their own zones that are secure. And a lot of times we go into do assessments, and even though there are different VLANs in place, there are no access controls between those VLANs. So it, in effect, is a flat network. So if I can compromise one system, I've got access to everything. Privileged identity management is another one that's huge. I think this coming to light, and that is, as Gates would attest, when his team does assessments, they actually get in and attack for default passwords and common passwords. And every device that you plug into your network, server, router, firewall, whatever, has typically a local admin account. And if you're not changing those from the default admin, or typical login password combinations, that's probably the easiest point of entry into a system.
I would agree with that, David, in the sense of, and as we conduct penetration testing, we're targeting those admin accounts root. We're trying to get to the domain admins. We're trying to use whatever flaw we can find to get to that high privilege level account. So, because once we get to there, it's just opening doors everywhere. And that's where, to David's point as well, that additional compartmentalization is really key to make sure that you're not going to have somebody be able to walk across your entire enterprise after just getting one pinhole into it.
Right, thanks. From a detection standpoint, this is, I think, probably the weakest area of any of our customers that we typically deal with. They really are not watching what's going on as far as what's leaving the network, what's the outbound traffic looks like. They're doing a good job of protecting things from coming in, but again, if I can do a phishing attack, get access into the network, once I'm in, I can typically exfiltrate any kind of data without detection. So there are a number of different tools that need to be looked at in this arena, from the unified security management of HIDs and MIDs, which is your host intrusion, network intrusion, event correlation, and then taking that data and not just storing it in a SIM, but actually running against the correlation engine that has some good threat intelligence behind it to give you actionable items and activities that are going on in your network. A lot of people, what we see is, per requirements for like PCI, it's required that you store your logs into a SIM. Well, there's millions and millions of log events that occur, and somebody just watching that SIM is not going to be able to find that needle in the haystack. The data loss prevention, I think, is going to be another area that we're going to see. Basically automated systems looking for data leaving your network. And so that's an area that we need to really look at. Next. Respond is basically, now that you've been breached, obviously you've got to have systems in place or procedures in place to deal with that. So typically what we see is if someone is breached, they don't have these already planned approaches to respond, and what happens is they're flying by the seat of their pants trying to realize what's going on, how do we mitigate it, what are the things that we need to do. So you need to make sure that you've got the appropriate people already lined up and the contact information for them to deal with the networks, or not just IT, but also your HR people, your business unit managers, accounting, different areas that have an impact into this area, especially legal, things like that. And then you've got to have a response team that knows how to triage the event. So if you don't have that expertise, look for outside expertise and bring them in sooner than later so that you can mitigate that issue. And then finally, basically, recovery is a big one where now that you've mitigated it, you've got to get into a recovery process. If you've been hit by Cryptolocker, did you have to pay the attacker to get your data back, or do you have a DR plan where you've got good backups? And really, that's going to be the key for Cryptolocker is you've got to make sure you've got good backups and you can restore from those types of events. One key area on the recovery side of things that I really like to point out is that you need to look at, as you've gone through this event, look at it from a standpoint of what did we do right, what did we do wrong. Don't do the finger pointing of, you know, it was somebody else's fault or this or that. You really got to define what are the events that occurred, how do we tighten it up for next time, because there will be a next time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Greg, kind of wrap it up. I know we're running a little bit long. We'll try to keep this as short as possible, but go ahead, Greg.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, David. So, just to kind of shift the gears here and talk about what we think we're going to see moving forward over the next 12 months for 2016. So just to talk drivers and intent, Gates really hit on this in his part of the presentation, but, we still think you're definitely going to see monetization of the data sets, right? I mean, that's what most of the drivers are that are out there, and especially with these anonymous payment channels, that part of that is not going to go away. If anything, it's going to continue to get worse. So certainly that driver is still going to be out there. Certainly hacktivism is still going to be something that's in place, especially given that you've got, there are a lot of politics and political years. That stuff typically gets worse. There's also a lot going on out in the rest of the world, be it, some of the conflicts that are out there and things like that. So we still feel like you're going to see a lot in that segment as well. And then obviously the espionage or the nation state actor is still going to be out there. We've seen that, with the Korean, what we supposed to be the North Koreans in the Sony breach. And then you've got a lot of activity with China and things that are going on there with basically stealing various types of data set at the federal level. So we do feel like we're going to continue to see all three of those drive a lot of the breaches or a lot of what's going on out there. As far as predictions on the payment card industry, right, we've got slow adoption of EMV, really kind of the low-hanging fruit from a worldwide perspective as far as magstripe data. So we think you're going to continue to see an increase in the credit card breaches here in the United States. Next slide. All right, one of the other pieces, which is probably not necessarily the coming storm, but is the storm that we're dealing with at this point, unfortunately, is this ransomware piece. And the next evolution that we're really seeing out there is ransomware as a service. And this is a key point, and Gates kind of hit on it with his piece. I think the takeaway there is to understand that a lot of this stuff is being productized, right? The attack vectors, the tools to manage these things. This is not somebody who has to have a high level of expertise anymore to conduct these types of attacks, which means basically more people can get involved in it, unfortunately. And we're starting to see basically platforms developed for ransomware as a service, and we've got a couple of pictures there with an example of that. So they'll do everything from an injection of the invulnerability, posting of content relevant to either the language or region that you're actually trying to penetrate into, and they'll even outflow the payments, and they just take a portion off the top for providing you that level of service. So pretty nasty stuff. It's going to get worse before it gets better. Next slide. All right, cloud provider. So everybody is looking to move data into the cloud, move infrastructure into the cloud. A lot of good stuff around it, right? You've got elasticity. You can apply more resources on demand. There's a lot of flexibility there. But I think one of the things that we will see coming out in the future here is basically an attack or a large compromise at the hypervisor layer of the cloud provider. And what that really means is if an attacker compromises that layer, they have access to the memory space, the storage, everything that is associated with every customer account that sits on top of that infrastructure. So there's a lot of incentive from a hacker's perspective to get into that layer. And we've seen a little bit of that over the last couple of months, some smaller events around that. But I think you're going to see a large zero-day exploit at that layer, and it's going to compromise a lot of data, unfortunately. So be mindful of that. Cloud's a good thing, but just be conscious of what type of data you're pushing out there into the cloud. Next line. All right, on the healthcare side, last year they called the year of the healthcare breach because of all the records that were compromised. Unfortunately, what you have in that industry is a large transition into electronic records management. I mean, this has literally gone from, say, 10% of the total healthcare records out there were electronic in 2010 to something on the order of 80 to 90% of those records now are handled electronically. It's good for healthcare, good for care, but the problem is you've got a lot of new systems out there, a lot of people that don't necessarily know how to protect those data sets properly. So we feel like you're going to continue to see a lot of those breaches in the healthcare space. All right, guys, at this point, we want to open this up to questions. Just to kind of wrap up here, I would like to extend, anybody that's on the call today as part of our partnership with TAG, we do want to offer a 30-minute session. If anybody has questions maybe that they don't want to ask on the call today, you certainly can reach out to us, and we'd be happy to set up a session with one of our consultants, and you can bounce ideas and questions off of them. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions, and thanks, everybody, for joining the call today.
I had a question. This is Zubair. I was going to ask, what are the biggest mistakes people make trying to protect their data?
So, I think the things that we see, kind of what Greenwell was saying, is not knowing where the data really lives, right? Sometimes you think you know where it's at, but until you do something like a data discovery exercise, you don't necessarily know where that data lives. And not having clear boundaries around production, meaning that, making sure that you have that compartmentalization and segmentation in place to really contain that data in a production environment where you do have all those security controls in place, or at least ideally have all those security controls in place.
Okay. Follow-up to that is how do you, with healthcare, I know they have their data spread across different platforms and different data centers. How do you think that's going to play into it now as we go and transition more into electronic health medical, like you said?
Well, I think to me, you're going to have to see the regulatory side catch up, right? So there are certain frameworks out there in the healthcare space, but they're definitely moving towards trying to enact more enforcement and basically giving some more teeth around that in healthcare space. I think healthcare, what we've seen, like we were recently at HIM, and what I think you see in that industry is a changing or an awareness that the problem is not going to go away from a breach standpoint, that these organizations are going to have to get serious about protecting this information. So that's at least the feel that we got from this year. It was a different discussion than maybe in years past. So I think hopefully that you'll see these organizations take security seriously, understand the ramifications if this data is breached, how that impacts the business or the brand, all those different pieces. Any other questions out there?
If no one else has one, I have another one.
Okay.
How can I protect myself from ransomware?
That's a good question. I think part of what as Greenwell says, I think one of the biggest things you can do is to prepare for it, right? And the safest thing that you can do is back up your data, your system data, right? So that if it does get locked up, you have something to go back to. Beyond that, it is a difficult piece. I mean, it's a combination of technical controls as well as operational pieces from a user perspective, right? Training your users is important, making sure they're aware not to click on things, to respond to phishing attacks, that kind of stuff. But you also want to make sure that you've got at least technology in there that if it doesn't prevent it, would at least identify it so that you're minimizing the impact. I mean, Greenwell can speak to an event. We've recently worked with a customer where they had several of successful Cryptolocker attacks, and not only was it encrypting the files on the local system, but what you've got to also think about is that it's anywhere it can get with write access. So let's say you've got your network file share out there, your corporate network, whatever it may be, it may start to lock up that stuff as well.
Yeah, and Greg, that's what one thing I would do is look at your global shares and really look at the access rights for different individuals, and do they really need write access into all of the folders, or there are only specific folders, things like that. You really got to tighten up what they have access to if possible.
Hey, this is Chaz. I had a question.
Okay.
Is there a particular operating system and or mobile operating system that is better or worse in terms of security? Like Windows 10, Windows Phone, BlackBerry, Android? Do you have any recommendations?
Gates, you want to run with that one?
Sure. Do we have personal preferences? I think that we do, but at the same time, any platform, any electronic device has some level of susceptibility to future exploitation. So really what I would look for there is not so much the platform, but making sure that there is a really solid patch channel for you to receive updates to that. Of course, Microsoft has that. A lot of Linux distributions have that. We see that within the cell phone space. As mentioned earlier to an extent, and with Android, because the manufacturer of the software and the manufacturer of the hardware are different, sometimes there's a delay in getting those updates pushed down as compared to, say, a different phone product where the hardware and the software are made together. But that doesn't necessarily mean that X is going to be always safe and Y is always going to be vulnerable. It's really just about keeping it updated and trying to keep yourself out of those areas where people are going to be able to exploit you easiest. So don't be the low-hanging fruit, basically.
Yeah, if you don't need flash on your system, get rid of it, things like that.
Yeah, on the mobile side, I would add kind of to that. I mean, it's I think you got to look at whether the system is open or closed, right? And whether you like Apple or not or how they do things, Apple has done a good job of creating that walled garden. They basically have a chain of trust for every single piece of application that goes on that device. So from an attack perspective, it makes it much harder to get something malicious on that device without basically approval or authorization from Apple, right? So, not to say that it can't happen, okay? There's always vulnerabilities out there, but to me, I think it's also looking at how open the platform is. Not that there's a good or bad with that, but just be mindful of the impact that can have.
Thanks.
Anybody else have any questions?
I've got it. Go ahead. I have a question.
Okay, guys.
Initially,
you do have a question. Okay, go ahead.
yeah. Well, I saw someone else was trying to talk at the same time. Initially, you touched on EMV, and that we're kind of back. We're kind of behind. I think it's 15 years from Europe, and it's been around for a little while. And, the little chip readers and that such are going into merchants to alleviate some of their exposure. what conditions, I mean, how does EMV, I still haven't got my head around that. How does EMV address online or internet payments, if it does, and mobile payments?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. So I guess the short answer is it doesn't, okay? So you definitely are going to still have the magstripe type of attack potential in an online transaction. EMV works because it has some logic and hardware on the card, right? So both sides of the transaction can do some things to help protect the data